Thank you. It's my first applause of the new year. I was trying to convince my children that I deserve that each morning, but they were not obliging. But welcome everyone to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. My name is Tony Penny, and I'm the director of the Annenberg Presidential Learning Center here at the Foundation. And on behalf of Mrs. Reagan, our Board of Trustees, and the entire staff of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, we consider it a tremendous privilege to welcome you to the library and final resting place of our nation's 40th president. To start our program today, I ask that you join me in honoring our men and women in uniform through the Pledge of Allegiance. So please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Excellent. Thank you. For those of you who are joining us from out of state, please accept my most sincere apologies for our harsh California winter. I think it's supposed to be 72 and sunny today. There's a slight breeze. I know some of you are heading back to places where the temperature begins and ends with 0, so it might be tough. But luckily, we Californians are very famous for our ability to persevere through even the most extreme weather, and so we'll make it through today. I wanted to take just a second to recognize a couple of our guests who are joining us today. From the Reagan Foundation senior staff, President Reagan's former chief of staff and our current chief administrative officer, Miss Joanne Drake. Thank you. From the National Speech and Debate Association, our good friend, Mr. Cherian Koshi. Thanks for coming out again. He's been working with us very closely on our great communicator debate series the last couple of times around. And finally, from the Calvin Coolidge Foundation, Trustee Milt Valera and Executive Director Matthew Dennert. Thank you for joining us today. So I think President Reagan would have been very excited to know that the USA debate team, comprised of our nation's most outstanding young communicators, has chosen his library to stage a showcase debate. President Reagan envisioned his library as being a place that would continue to discuss the ideas that played an important role in his presidency. Things like, what kind of government should we have? How much government is too much government? How best to expand the frontiers of freedom around the world? How best to help those who seem to have lost hope? And how to achieve our national destiny? Over the course of the many years since it has opened, the library has served as a national center for public affairs. We've had former presidents, Supreme Court justices, numerous members of Congress, both past and present. We've had authors and entrepreneurs. We've hosted several presidential debates and had movers, shakers, and leaders from across sectors come to this place to discuss issues of pressing national and international importance. Well, I hope you'll forgive me if I find this event to be every bit as exciting as all of these other events we host. President Reagan said in his farewell address to the nation, "All great change in America begins at the dinner table." So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents have not been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do. I agree with President Reagan, as is good form here at the Foundation. But I would add that in addition to the dinner table, great change begins when thoughtful, dedicated, intelligent people, like those you'll hear from in just a few minutes, have the freedom to engage in the discussion of important issues. The habits you've developed as debaters mean that you will be the leaders, movers, shakers, and change makers of tomorrow. So I am very excited here early in 2015 to get a sneak preview of the future of our country today. So now, let me turn the microphone over to the outstanding coach of the USA debate team from the great state of Texas, Miss Cindy Timmons.
Thank you so much for having us here today. You're probably here because you either love debate or you love a debater, you're a family member, and we are excited to be here. This is an honor to be in this library. My first presidential election that I was able to vote in was for Mr. Reagan, and I remember as a teenager in the 70s, it was a very difficult time to be growing up with the things that were going on, and as a debater, I appreciated that President Reagan was the great communicator and brought our country back together. So to share this team with you in this place is special to my heart. I'm the team manager for USA Debate. And also with us, I want to introduce a couple of people who will be judging today's debate. Erin Timmons, who is the coach. Cherian Koshi, who is the Director of Development for the National Speech and Debate Association. And then Joanne Drake will be judging for us as well. This year we have 12 students on the national team. The national team is sponsored by the National Speech and Debate Association, which is the national organization for our country and the leading organization for speech and debate in the entire world. 12 students were selected from a competitive application process, and they represent our great state as a country as we travel around the world, this year culminating with the World Championship, which will be held in Singapore beginning in July. In order to have our students be able to have their families come and see them, of the 12 students, we are showcasing our California debaters because we knew that they would be able to have their families come with us. So as I introduce them, please know that all the students are outstanding, but we're kind of highlighting for you today our Los Angeles and California debaters. As I call them up, I will introduce them by team, and then they will come up at that point and sit at your spots. Representing the team government, which is the side in favor of the motion today, is Jasper Premack, who hails from Massachusetts, Sarah Eval, who is from Los Angeles, Milan Amatraj, who is also from Los Angeles, and Amelia Miller from Los Angeles. Representing the opposition today, the side opposed to the motion, we begin with Nikki Halterman, who hails from Oklahoma, Jane Irons from Los Angeles, Matthew Zhang from Los Angeles, and Nicholas Angelopoulos from Los Angeles. The other 4 members of our team will be introducing the format and the procedures that we'll be using in today's debate. So if they will come up as I call their names so that they will be ready to go. We're going to begin with Tiana Menon from Colorado, who will be introducing the format. Then Abby Marone from Pennsylvania will be explaining one of the unique characteristics of this format so that you understand what's going on at a particular point. Matali Mather will also be going over how we are going to be timing the event. She's from Texas. And then Sunhee Simon, sitting at the table here, is our moderator, and she is from New Jersey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiana Menon, and I'm going to explain to you the World Schools format, the form of debate we participate in on the United States National Debate Team. First established in 1988 in Australia, the World Schools format has significantly increased in popularity. Initially, only 6 countries participated. However, in the following 3 decades, over 45 countries currently participate, and it's still growing. We're really excited to see the increased interest here locally in the United States, and we're even more excited to see it grow here at home. But now, let's look at the format itself. Reminiscent of the British parliamentary debating style, teams assume the positions of the government and the opposition. The government, or team proposition, always opens debate, framing and outlining their advocacy in the 8 minutes allotted. Immediately following is an 8-minute speech of refutation and argumentation from team opposition. This pattern of 8-minute speeches for both government and opposition continues down the table until all 3 speakers have given a speech. After the final opposition speaker has spoken, the team gives their 2 4-minute speeches, also known as the reply speech. In this portion of the debate, the speaker will evaluate the course of debate through their declaration of reasoning behind their team's victory. The opposition team will give the first of these 2 speeches, while the government gives the second, ensuring that the government concludes the debate. While there are typically only 3 speakers on a world debate team, our debate has 4 speakers, so we can showcase each talented member of our team. But during World Schools competition, generally the first or second speaker will give the reply speech. But now, Abby will talk to you about points of information, a questioning style unique to the World Schools format.
Thank you, Tiana. Good morning. My name's Abby Marone, and I'm going to explain points of information. Unlike traditional forms of American debate, there's no specific questioning or cross-examination period. Instead, opposing debaters may interrupt the other team to offer a brief point during the ongoing speech. The current speaker can either accept or reject the point. However, the first minute and the last minute of each speech are in protected time, meaning that no points can be offered. This is to ensure that the debater can deliver their introduction and conclusion without interruption. While there is no specific rule regarding how many points must be accepted during a speech, speakers traditionally accept 1 to 2. Taking fewer points may be interpreted as a lack of confidence from the debater, but if the speaker accepts more than 2, they risk losing too much time from their speech's content. Points of information are often used strategically. Even if the point is rejected, it can still be an effective tool. It can distract the other team or draw attention to a faulty statement. When a debater wants to offer a point of information, they will stand up and raise their hand like this. Then they will exclaim something like, "Sir," "Ma'am," or "point." The current speaker may reject the point by saying, "No, thank you," or by waving them down like this, or they can accept the point. Once the point is accepted, the current speaker either cuts off the speaker or allows them to finish and then gives their response. There's not a specific way to deal with the point. A speaker may either respond directly and immediately, or say that they'll respond to the point later on in their speech. Points of information are a terrific and unique way for debaters to engage in the debate while it is happening. Now Mitali will talk to you a little bit more about some interesting things you will see and hear during today's debate.
Hello everyone, my name's Mitali Mather, and I'm going to be talking about how the World Schools debate format is very engaging. The World Schools debate format is uniquely engaging to the audience. You will hear a few sounds during the debate, as well as see a few motions. Throughout the debate, in addition to seeing debaters stand up or get waved down for points of information, like Abby explained to you, you will also notice that debaters will tap their tables. This action is similar to clapping, and it is often used to show support for an argument, to welcome the debater to the stage, and also to thank the debater for their words. The audience can also participate in this to signal support for one side of the debate. Although the tapping should not be used to be too loud or too persistent, but it can be used strategically to give credence to certain arguments and also to show team coherence if everyone on the team taps at the same time. Team coherence is especially important in World Schools debate because while individuals will give their own unique speeches, they also have to function as a team unit instead of separate individuals. The last noise that will be heard is the bell. The timekeeper will ring the bell at the 1-minute mark and the 7-minute mark during constructive speeches to distinguish between protected and unprotected time for points of information. In addition, the timekeeper will ring the bell twice to indicate to the debater that they should end their speech and conclude the speech. This will happen at the 8-minute mark for constructive speeches and at the 4-minute mark for reply speeches. The World Schools debate format is very interactive and engaging. We hope you participate and will enjoy the debate. I'd now like to hand over the floor to our wonderful moderator, Sunhee Simon, who will begin the debate.
Thank you, Mitali. Now, without further ado, the chair now calls this House into order. The motion we're debating today will be, this House believes that the benefits of executive action in matters such as immigration reform outweigh the harms. The chair now recognizes the first speaker of the government, Jasper Premack. Here.
Before I begin, I'd like to give several thank yous for the entire U.S. debate team. First, thank you to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. The foundation's generous support of discourse, debate, and research is an incalculable service to the United States. Specifically, we'd like to thank Anthony Penny, Whitney Pagan, and Joanne Drake. We'd also like to thank our coaches, Aaron Timmons, Cindy Timmons, and Dr. Alfred Snyder. Your support helps us grow and succeed in our pursuit of debate and excellence. We'd also like to extend our thanks to the National Speech and Debate Association. The U.S. debate team represents the diversity of America, and it is only through the association's financial support that we are able to represent the United States at international competitions. Finally, I'd like to thank the audience. We would not be here without your presence, and we're very glad that you've chosen to join us in this public debate. With that, let's begin. President Ronald Reagan once said, "When you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat." President Reagan recognized that generally, limited government is the best government. But President Reagan also recognized that sometimes the United States will be paralyzed by gridlock and inaction during times of crisis, when it is the duty of the president to step in and protect the American people. Because sometimes executive action is a necessary reaction, this House believes that the benefits of executive action in matters such as immigration reform outweigh the harms. We will offer two definitions to help clarify today's debate. Matters such as immigration reform means policy issues of immediate national interest. Executive action means the president's legally binding actions meant to address specific issues. While this debate will center around the merits of executive action, we will use immigration reform as a recurring example. Our first substantive argument is on taking immediate action. The United States will always face issues of national crisis, from national disasters to foreign policy threats to humanitarian crises taking place within our own borders. Our responses to these crises must be both fast and effective. Otherwise, it is the people of the United States that will suffer.
Sir,
Yes.
don't people suffer more when we rush into hasty and poorly thought out policies?
It is better to have an imperfect response to a crisis than to have no response at all. If there are lives on the line, the president must take immediate action to help save them. For example, in June 2012, President Obama implemented by executive order the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Under federal law prior to the executive order, President Obama would have been required to deport hundreds of thousands of dreamers, children who were brought here illegally as children and for whom the United States is their only home. President Obama's executive order acknowledged a humanitarian side of the United States and prevented an incalculable human tragedy. So why is the president necessary? Well, Congress will often take time to come to decisions. It's a decision-making body, part of our democracy, and that also means that it can take time. For example, Congress has tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform 10 times in the past 20 years under 3 different presidential administrations, and each time they've failed. At the same time, state agencies might not have clear jurisdiction over matters of national interest. When thousands of children were crossing the US-Mexico border this summer, Texas and Arizona weren't able to come up with immediate responses because it was unclear who had jurisdiction over taking care of these children. The president has the broadest legal authority in our nation. The president's supreme federal authority can help clarify areas of jurisdiction that are immediately unclear. The president is also capable of directing action across the nation. While individual agencies like FEMA or the Department of Immigration might have jurisdiction over specific areas, only executive action can create a coordinated response. If the president uses executive action, the United States will never be paralyzed during times of crisis, giving time for Congress to come up with permanent legislative solutions that can help to address shortcomings in our legal system and jurisdiction. No, thank you. Our second substantive argument is starting a conversation. Very often, action across the United States is necessary to spark conversations in society, whether or not we ought to change our legal systems in order to create change. When the most powerful figure in US politics, the President of the United States, addresses an issue, it immediately garners national interest, gaining large amounts of national attention and sparking a conversation about what the United States ought to do to address that issue. The President is capable of changing the mindsets of people all across the country. Executive action is far more powerful than simple speech, because it's unavoidable. No one can ignore an executive order, but it is very powerful to ignore a speech on the part of the president. Yes, sir.
There's no real significant reason why the president cannot enact effective change in discourse through speeches. The best way to talk to somebody is to talk to them, not to sign a law.
Each year, the president gives the State of the Union address, during which he gives a laundry list of reforms he'd like to see Congress make. Very rarely does the State of the Union actually result in permanent legislative change. It's only when the president uses executive orders to help back up his words that we can see these changes in our society. No thank you. The use of executive orders has deep historical precedent in the United States. Civil rights, and specifically the foundation of the civil rights movement, was built on executive orders. During the Civil War, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the South both as a war tactic and to address an outdated and horrendous institution in American politics. The Emancipation Proclamation was the political impetus for later reforms, like the 13th Amendment, that finally helped to end slavery. At the same time, President Truman recognized after the Second World War that the United States military's policy of segregation between soldiers was not just. President Truman issued executive orders that created a Civil Rights Commission and integrated the military. And that commission and the integration of the military opened the way for Congress to integrate all of the federal government, and also sparked a national conversation about ending segregation entirely. President Lyndon Johnson also recognized that in the United States during his tenure, there was still discrimination against minorities and against women. His executive orders ending deliberate discrimination in federal contractors helped pave the way for actions like the Equal Opportunity Act, which banned discrimination all across the United States. At the same time, President Ronald Reagan was also a proponent of executive action. President Ronald Reagan's executive actions, as well as those of the first Bush administration, the Immigrant Family Acts, allowed nuclear families of illegal immigrants to remain in the United States. These acts also made it illegal for employers to hire illegal immigrants, but also created a humanitarian system of dealing with those already in the United States.
Sir.
These standards were not being addressed at all by Congress, and the actions of President Reagan and President Bush helped pave the way for other reforms to immigration in the United States. More recently, President Obama issued an executive order raising the minimum wage for federal contractors. While the president on his own cannot raise the minimum wage across the country, President Obama's executive order helped spark a national conversation about the merits of the minimum wage. It sparked media attention and at the same time also created many political lobbying groups, helping to raise the minimum wage in cities like Seattle. But apart from the minimum wage, it also created a national conversation about poverty relief, creating discussion about how best to reform welfare programs in order to help reduce poverty in the United States. This motion is about the benefits versus the harms. And for millions of Americans, executive orders are the gap between discrimination on the part of employers. They are the gap between being thrown out of the United States and back into humanitarian disaster zones. In times of crisis, the president should act, because only executive action can create an immediate and pragmatic response to the crises that our nation will face. We're very proud to propose.
We thank Jasper for those very interesting comments, and now the chair recognizes the first speaker of side opposition, Nikki Halterman. Here.
Before I begin, I would also like to extend our thanks on behalf of Team Opposition to be here. This sort of opportunity is what all of us dreamed of when we joined debate, and we'd like to extend our thanks to every one of you for helping make this possible. A government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. What President Reagan understood when he said those words is the simple fact that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When our country was designed, its founders were careful to ensure that no one person would acquire so much power that he or she risked losing sight of their purpose, to serve the American people. We believe that governments should be beholden to their citizens, not the other way around. And because we stand opposed to any policy that allows one individual to lose sight of the needs of the country, it is an honor to oppose this motion. In this speech, I'll be doing two things. I'll begin by addressing the points brought up by team proposition, and then present the first two substantive arguments on team opposition, that major executive orders are an overextension of presidential power, and that these actions are ineffective. But let us begin with what team proposition told you in their last speech. To start off, they told you executive action is needed when we need to act immediately. We have three problems with this argument. Firstly, we believe that major issues and crises like immigration don't happen overnight. Immigration problems are structural. They take time to emerge. But I hear dissent.
Crises with refugees happen immediately. If it were not for executive action, hundreds of thousands of refugees would have been left to perish.
Of course, we can't pass a law in Congress every time there's an immediate natural disaster. That's why we have our second problem with this argument, which is that we already have organizations in place to respond to immediate crises. We have FEMA. We have other organizations that are designed to respond quickly. It isn't Congress's role to legislate every single policy, but it is Congress's role to set our policy towards structural issues, like immigration, that emerge over decades, not overnight. But our third issue with this argument is that this can be used as justification for simple overextension or abuse of power. Oftentimes, you see people using this rhetoric of immediate action, of we must act now, in order to prevent people from taking a close look at the policies they're implementing. Let us think back to the Second World War, certainly a time of crisis, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, implementing Japanese internment camps. That was a policy that was too major for one person to decide. That was a policy that should have passed through Congress, that should have had dissenting opinions. And because it did not, it is one of the stains on our country's history. We believe that this mindset, that we must do something, that we cannot afford to wait for debate, is exactly the kind of reasoning that has led to some of the worst mistakes in our history. There is always time for debate when the fate of our country is on the line. But their second argument is that this will help start a conversation. We agree that it is the role of the executive to start conversations. However, there is a reason that President Reagan was known as the great communicator, and it wasn't for his executive actions. It was for his speeches. It was for his ability to communicate directly with the people that he wanted to be part of the conversation. You do not start a conversation by legislating. You do not start a conversation by signing pieces of paper. You start a conversation by talking. We believe that when you start a conversation with the executive order, you taint the nature of that conversation. Let us look no further than immigration reform right now. Rather than focusing on the true issues of illegal immigration, we are instead asking ourselves whether President Obama's actions were legal. We are instead debating whether or not we should have lawsuits. We are debating congressional overturn, instead of focusing on the issue itself. Yes, executive orders start conversations, but not about issues, rather about the overextension of presidential power. And we do not believe that that is the conversation our country needs. But now, allow me to present the first substantive argument on team opposition, which is that major executive orders are an overextension of presidential power. Firstly, we believe they are overextension of constitutional power. If you read the Constitution, executive orders and actions are never once explicitly mentioned. And although we may not be strict constructionalists, what we find troubling is when a president uses a means that was never granted to him in the Constitution in order to give himself powers never described in the Constitution. Let us think back to September 30th of 2011, when an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, was executed with no trial by a drone strike, authorized by an executive order from President Obama. We believe that that sort of policy is a direct overextension of constitutional power, when executive orders are used to allow the executive to dodge the checks that should be on his power and to institute policies that put every one of American citizens' rights and lives at risk. That is too much government. That is dangerous government. But second of all, we believe this is an overextension of power because it bypasses the checks and balances in the American system. When our country was created, it was very deliberately designed with both a separation of power and a balance of power. Every branch of the government has its role, and it has limits on its power to prevent abuse. That's why Congress passes laws and the executive enforces them. But when the president is allowed to institute policies, there are none of the normal checks that are in Congress. There's no minority opinion, there's no debate, there's no congressional overview, there's no legal counsel, and we institute laws that never should have been passed. Simply think back to Japanese internment camps. They certainly would not have happened in the same way if we'd had true congressional debate, But because the executive took on the role of the legislature, those checks and balances were made meaningless. Thirdly, we believe this is an extension of power because it invalidates compromise. When an executive passes policy unilaterally, there is no compromise. Who does the president have to compromise with? When one person writes a policy, there's no dissenting opinion and there's no one to compromise with. This leads to bills that never should have been considered. But second of all, what we see is that in the legislature themselves, this means that dissenting opinions have no reason to actually compromise. Imagine that you're a Democrat in the House. Why would you ever pass a bill when simply by waiting, you can get President Obama to executive order a legislation you could never pass through Congress? If the president is going to step in, there's no incentive for Congress to actually do its job. But I hear dissent.
Yes, Congress is not actually making progress because Congress is trying to find a way to get reelected rather than actually help the people. We need the president
Thank you.
helping the people.
We believe the reason that Congress is so unproductive is because they know they can get away with not doing anything because the executive will always step in. We should hold Congress responsible for their duties, not simply shift it to a different branch of the government. But the second substantive argument on team opposition is that executive action is ineffective. Firstly, we believe it is ineffective because it does not pass through the normal legislative process. Congress has a number of institutions designed to ensure that the laws it passes are the best we can get. Of course, it's not a perfect policy, but it's the best we have. When one person writes a policy, even if that policy is a good idea, it is often sloppily written or sloppily executed. Let us think back to President Ronald Reagan's action on immigration. While we salute his vision for what our country needed, we wish that he had worked through compromise and cooperation with Congress rather than through unilateral action, because the Immigration Families Act had loopholes that allowed thousands of immigrants to cross the border and soured the debate and angered Congress because of the unilateral and, quite frankly, subpar action of an executive, when that vision would have been better carried out through the legislature. But second of all, we believe that the temporary nature of executive actions puts things in jeopardy. Let's consider the current action on immigration. There are thousands of undocumented workers who are terrified to step forward and claim their new rights because they know that in 2 years, those rights could be taken away and they could have put themselves in jeopardy by stepping forward. Laws should be stable, laws should be dispendable, and executive actions are not. We believe that it is time for our country to have responsible action, and that is the legislature, not the president, that has the capacity to give us laws that we can depend on and serve our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Halterman, for that wonderfully persuasive speech. And now we welcome up the second speaker from the government, Sarah Eval. Here.
Ronald Reagan once said, "Status quo, is Latin for the mess we're in." Let's take a look at the mess we're in currently. Congress is doing practically nothing for whatever reason. They're leaving the pleas of many, like illegal immigrants, completely unanswered. Without executive action, we would remain indefinitely in this mess and others like it. Because of the unique ability for executive action to break through the paralysis of progress by inaction in times of crisis, we are proud to propose today's motion. In my speech today, I'll begin by refuting my opponent's points. I will then respond to their criticisms of Jasper's first 2 points and explain why they still stand. Finally, I will bring up our third point, which is that executive action bolsters democracy. So let's look at the first point that we heard from the opposition today, which was that this is an overextension of power. They talked about lack of constitutionality, and they talked about drones and a lack of compromise in Congress. But we have a few issues with this, and the first is that we believe that their definition of an overextension of power is completely arbitrary because it has no legal backing. The Supreme Court, the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, actually has affirmed the president's authority to act on issues of federal importance like immigration using executive action in the 2002 case of Arizona versus the United States. Secondly, people have granted this power to the president and accepted. Democracy relies on this idea that the people's assent is what should determine policy. The people have given their assent. Therefore, this is fundamentally democratic. With their point about drones, yes, we see that this is not a perfect system, but one example of one American life lost cannot be used to discredit the millions of lives that have been benefited directly from refugee reforms, from things like helping illegal immigrants integrate, to helping children stranded at our border. We cannot discredit this based on one example. And lastly, they talked about compromise being blocked in Congress, but we all know that this is blocked because they don't actually want to do anything for us. They just want to be reelected. So now let's move into their second point. No, thank you. Their second point was about how executive actions are ineffective. They talked about loopholes, problems with legislation. They talked about problems with implementation and fear of repeal. Yes, sometimes there are going to be flaws in the system. This is politics. But just because sometimes executive action doesn't work 100% effectively 100% of the time, this does not outweigh the unique benefits that we've seen gained through executive actions, like for furthering general equality, like for ending racial discrimination, for forwarding women's rights, for helping give rights to refugees and to immigrants. This has changed the lives of so many people. Just because they may have a few quips with the implementation, it does not mean that we discredit this institution for all of the good that it has done. Furthermore, about repeals. Yes, sometimes people may be afraid of repeals, but thousands more immigrants are stepping forward and claiming the rights that they never would have had without executive action. So we see that human lives are directly benefited from the progress that has been made. Now let's move into our case today on the proposition. Our first point was about the benefits of taking immediate actions. They talked about how major pressing issues occur over a long period of time, and there are systems in place to deal with it, and this justifies bad action like internment camps. I'd like to begin by dealing with this point of internment camps. We are not going to try to defend this action. Yes, it is absolutely a bloody stain on our history, but this, again, is one action, similar to the one action that was drones. At the time, it was deemed necessary. While we may not agree with that now, it was the political climate of the time. And furthermore, this does not mean that this discredits, as I've said, the countless millions of lives that have been improved and saved by executive action. Now to their point about how issues develop over a long period of time. This is not actually always true. President Carter issued an executive order to rescue 130,000 refugees from Saigon in the Indochina Wars, many of them who were stranded in the South China Sea. Yes.
Their characterization of this major crisis and its time frame is absolutely naive. Those crises take months and months to solve, and legislation can happen in that time. Not all 130,000 of those refugees were in the ocean at sea.
It doesn't take people months to move from their homes into the ocean. That happens pretty immediately. And the fact of the matter is that these people were stranded in the ocean, and who cares how many of the 130,000 there were? These are still human lives. These people were stranded, they were starving, they were dying, and they were suffering. And without executive action, they probably would have been left to die. So we see that human lives are saved and human dignity is upheld because of executive actions. The systems in place could not do such good. Now let's move on to our second point. Our second point was about how actually executive action starts a conversation and encourages long-term change. Here's what we heard on this issue. We heard that this was the wrong way to start a conversation, and it's tainted because of the controversial nature of these actions. Just because an action is controversial does not mean it was wrong. The Emancipation Proclamation was certainly an example of a controversial executive action, as was a variety of different civil rights legislation. But does that mean that it's not worth it because people were angry about it? Absolutely not. This entire nation has been forwarded in history because these actions were controversial, but they were taken, yes.
The issue is not that the issues themselves are controversial, but rather that use of executive order shifts the conversation away from the issues and towards the legal authority of the president.
Great, let's talk about literally every part about politics. We want the American people to stay informed, to discuss their opinion. And furthermore, some conversation about multiple aspects of society is better than no conversation at all. So let's look at why our point still stands. Often, conversations simply do not begin until problems are thrust into the spotlight. The president has the unique power to garner massive amounts of immediate coverage with anything that they do. And taking an executive action brings critical problems into the forefront of society. Conversations of and opinions on the civil rights movement, problems of inequality in the workplace, and immigration reform were forwarded by leaps and bounds due to executive action. Executive action forced people to realize that they were seeing others as subhuman. It forced people to confront the ideas that they were treating others without enough human dignity. And it forced people to change their minds and to start seeing each other as equal. So we see that these conversations are absolutely integral to forwarding society and are absolutely necessary. Now I'm going to move into our third point in today's debate, which is that executive actions bolster democracies and society on a whole. As I've said previously, the core tenet of democracy is that solutions are reached through consensus. It's that we elect people in order to help make decisions for us and on our behalf. But unfortunately, due to what's happening in Congress now and has been for a while, solutions aren't being reached. Progress is being stagnated, and we are not having the progress that we need to see in society in order for our government and for our people to remain functional. We have, as a country, through the Supreme Court and through the Constitution, invested a unique power into the hands of the president. We've said that when other people aren't taking the actions that are necessary, you can do this for us. And the president is the one person in the entirety of the United States who is elected by every member of the population, of course, over the age of 18. So what we see is that people have invested their power into this one figure to take action when action is needed, and no one else is willing to do it. And this means that we must support executive action because it keeps our democracies up and running and functional. Furthermore, we do see that presidents do not have the unlimited power that the opposition would like to tell you they do. There are a myriad of checks and balances on them. Presidents need to retain political popularity. They have the media attention to check their actions. They have international standards to uphold, and they have the threat of impeachment always at their back. So what we see is that presidents will take actions that are justified, that are morally requisite, and that serve the people because they have to, based on the way that the system is structured. Overall, what we see is that in issues like immigration reform, we need the president to take the power that they were given, the powers to decide where they allocate different resources through executive action to make sure that laws are upheld as best as possible. So in conclusion, what we see is that executive action offers a unique means by which crises can be solved quickly and effectively, and may best help improve the lives of everyone living in the United States. Thus, because executive action is a necessary reaction, and because we see the benefits of executive action far outweigh the harms, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for those phenomenal remarks. And now we welcome up the second speaker from side opposition, Jane Irons. Here.
So far from the proposition, we've heard several general quotes about light, heat, and the mess that we see. But clearly, they are not seeing the light, as they haven't put these quotes in their context. Let's look at a Reagan quote that truly reveals what he believed. He said, "Concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty." This country is built upon this idea. Ever since this country rebelled against the tyrannical, imperial British government, we have believed that power should not be concentrated in one individual or even a small group of individuals. It should be equally distributed among many people. Now, they say history repeats itself, but it's really looking uncanny. Due to executive action, some now even call our presidency the imperial presidency. We need to stop our presidency from becoming like our previous monarchs and those that we previously tried to escape. And thus, we say that executive orders are not a good thing. So first of all, I'm going to start off by going over our points and introducing our new point. Then I'll go over their points, because in essence, our point is directly responsive to all of theirs. So first, point one, which is that executive orders are antithetical to democratic ideals. So they say, essentially, the American people are okay with these executive orders, and that it is constitutional according to the Supreme Court. We have three responses. First, the American people clearly are not actually okay with executive orders. We see that the more Obama took independent action, the more traction the Tea Party gained. Then they took larger majorities in the House, and many of them actually signed contracts saying that they would never vote for something that Obama supported in order to check his power. Furthermore, we see many states that are upset. 17 states, for example, are suing Obama for his immigration reform. That clearly shows the American people are not happy with this. Second, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is somewhat flawed, even though they are often correct. So for example, they once ruled that separate but equal was a fair policy. Now, so clearly we can see just because one time they said that something was right does not mean it inherently is democratic. But then third, the nature of executive orders have clearly changed since the Supreme Court case. Obama, rather than just creating new laws via executive order, repealed laws via executive order. Now, in the Constitution, there's a specific clause that is referred to as the Take Care Clause that says that Obama, or whoever the president is, must enforce Congress's laws that they pass. By repealing it, he went directly against the words of the Constitution. So now our second point, which is that executive orders, in essence, lead to ineffective policy. They say sometimes there are immediate needs that have to be reached, and they talk about how Congress cannot reach these decisions. We have a few answers. First, this immediacy inherently comes at several costs. If it's an executive order, it can be immediately repealed when the next president takes power. Here, that's in 2 years. Thus, these immigrants who came forward once would be no longer safe as soon as Obama is out of office. But now, it's going to be even harder for us to implement a long-term solution because now people resent Obama for passing this law. Congress is voting against him because they resent him for passing this law. So now we just have more gridlock, less chance of a long-term solution for immigration, and many immigrants' position is still incredibly unstable. Furthermore, we have the issue of legal problems. In essence, because if the executive passes it, it's not double-checked with states, with legislators, etc. There are often more loopholes, more problems, and the law doesn't end up being as effective. So now moving on to our third point, which is that executive orders entrench adversarial politics. An adversarial environment is one charged with hostility. And if we've learned anything from the UN recently, especially Russia, it's that a hostile environment is anything but productive to progress. So this essentially angers three big groups: the states, Congress, and the justices. Otherwise, this is known as basically every single pillar of our government system. This is a fairly unique point. Essentially, if we win this point, we win the whole debate, because it doesn't matter if executive orders are actually effective or not, or practically good. Their perception is negative, and anger kills compromise. People vote based on their perceptions, and that is ultimately what's most important. So first of all, the states. We see this conflict goes back to the beginning of America. Two of our first big political parties were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. States' rights versus national government have always been a big issue. What happens when the president has executive orders is that one man can enforce something in all states. This often allows a single party to have a certain type of tyranny. For example, if there's a Republican Senate and a House, a single Democratic president could still decide policy that would majorly affect red states. That's inherently unfair to voters. Furthermore, if we look at the immigration reform, as I said previously, 17 states are suing. The North Carolina governor said, and quote, "The president has exceeded the balance of power that is clearly laid out in the US Constitution." Rick Perry, since the immigration orders starting in 2012, has deployed over 1,000 National Guard to the border. He's endangering people at the border, he's threatening violence, and in essence, he's causing a lot more dysfunction than there was previously. In essence, state cooperation is necessary in order to have a functioning legislative system. Then next, we look at Congress. First of all, Congress, as I described before, gets to pass laws, and the president has to faithfully execute them. Obama is not faithfully executing. Instead, he's repealing laws that Congress has passed, which is clearly unconstitutional. In addition, we can see that John Boehner is actually trying to sue Barack Obama for this. In addition, before he had passed the executive order, pundits had predicted that the House would actually pass the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act and take credit for it in order to increase Republican popularity. However, now that Obama has gone ahead with his executive order, they cannot vote with him, and it's not expected to pass, purely due to the fact that it's expected to decrease their popularity and make them look subservient to Barack Obama. The third part of this is justices. Essentially, it creates conflict between the justice branch and the executive branch. Andrew Jackson once said about the judicial branch, "He made his decision, now let him enforce it," as a way of scoffing at the judicial branch. He basically silenced them and said, "I'm not going to listen to you." This is what continuously happens when the president continues with these executive orders. So ultimately, then we move on to the impact there, which is that essentially almost every single problem that the proposition talks about, this gridlock, anger, inability to respond immediately, is something that is inherent to, that is caused by executive orders. When the president overreaches, he ends up being hurt, the Congress ends up being not able to cooperate with him, and thus checks and balances is destroyed. So then these answer their three arguments. First of all, their first argument is that this creates immediate action. So we basically already answered this. This creates more gridlock, there's going to be less immediate action, and ultimately, we actually solve better in the long term. Because, for example, while Obama may have saved the Dreamers in 2012, once the next president takes power, they can be immediately deported, and now no long-term solution will be reached because of arguments in the Senate and the House. In addition, immediate action allowed things like Japanese internment and the immediate execution of an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki. Their second point was about how it starts a national conversation. A few answers here. First of all, Reagan, as said by my previous speaker, drove change through discourse. He guided people through logic and persuaded rather than forcing them. He was known as the great communicator, not the great dictator. And because I believe in communication, and yes. So then executive orders, they essentially say that more people pay attention to these, is create a greater national conversation than something like the State of the Union. Now, I can guarantee you that more people watch the State of the Union than read executive orders. This is especially difficult to do because they aren't actually written down, as they aren't codified laws, which is yet another problem. So ultimately, the second proposition speaker said, the status quo is a word for the mess we're in. So look around at the mess we're in. Why is Congress up in arms right now? Because Obama keeps passing executive orders. The mess we're in is due to executive orders. And the only way to truly mop up that mess is to stop the executive from spilling into the legislative branch and overstepping its boundaries.
Thank you, Jane, for those strong points. And now we bring up the third speaker from side proposition to give us the next speech, Millen Armitage. Here.
Side opposition fundamentally misunderstands the landscape of the world today. Speeches alone cannot break the gridlock we're in. Rhetoric can't dig us out of the hole that our country has fallen so far into. The only option to stop us from falling deeper down is for the president to exercise the executive powers of his office and fulfill the role he was meant to take. We need executive action. And with that in mind, I'm going to be asking 3 questions about today's round. First, do alternatives to executive action exist? Second, is the president justified in taking this action? And finally, are these executive actions effective? But let's begin with the fact whether alternatives exist or not. Now, side opposition is so keen on bringing up alternatives such as FEMA, but then why do we have executive action in the first place? It's because FEMA and organizations like it are only effective in certain situations. FEMA is key for stopping things like natural disasters, but can do nothing when millions of immigrant children are being deported. This is a key issue that we can't simply ignore. But then they go on to say that organizations such as the Red Cross can be helpful in situations where people need to be fed or in other natural disasters. But last time I checked, the Red Cross isn't effective in protecting people who are going to be sent out of our country and into barren lands where they cannot fend for themselves. There are no alternative organizations. We need executive action. But second, they're again keen on pointing out the fact that discourse in Congress can start a discussion. This simply isn't the case. First, there really isn't any discourse in Congress, because I think we can all agree there isn't much debate going on in Congress today. But then we need to understand that the only way to start action truly is through controversy. At the end of the day, people like to latch on to controversial topics. When they're brought into the light, that's what people like to talk about, the controversial issues. Even if side opposition argues that the action itself is controversial, at least people are looking at the action. At least people are looking at immigration reform. In the status quo, inside opposition's world, nothing takes place and we're not discussing anything. Congress tried at least 12 times in the past to pass immigration reform and nothing happened without executive action. This is because no debate happens in Congress unless the president takes concrete action. Next, let's look to the fact that there's no other way to shatter gridlock, because without discussion and without executive action, we can't do anything.
Yes, sir. If we as a country and a Congress can't decide what is right, then we shouldn't be taking action at all. We risk the same sort of mistakes as Japanese internment camps.
This isn't our country. This is adversarial politics within Congress, which simply aren't willing to reach a conclusion. This is party politics, not the will of the people. The will of the people is represented by the elected official, the president, who needs to take action in order to remedy this problem. But next, let's look to the fact that in the status quo, speeches aren't effective. President Reagan, the great communicator himself, needed to use executive action to reach his goals because they are effective. Speeches aren't enough. Rhetoric isn't enough today. And with the midterm elections coming up, this is only going to get worse. To tackle the issues of the day, we need executive action, and we need it now. But our second question in today's round is the president justified in taking this action? They say that there are no checks on the president's power in this case. But each and every one of you in this room, the people, are the ultimate check on the president. Sir. He can't simply do what he wants because at the end of the day, the president, he or she is beholden to the will of the people. A president can't simply do anything because the people checks them at the end of the day. They go on to say then that the Constitution does not outline executive powers or executive orders, but Constitution clearly outlines executive powers of the president to take actions. Moreover, Supreme Court cases hold up this decision and say that the president is justified in taking executive action in cases such as immigration reform. The president is clearly constitutionally viable when we look to these questions. But then they go on to say this violates checks and balances. The founding fathers of our nation didn't anticipate a world in which parties would be so gridlocked that nothing could get done in Congress. The president in himself, ironically, is the ultimate check on the system of checks and balances. He's the one person who can break this tie, who can ultimately make a decision when no other politics is occurring, and who can change the status quo that side opposition is so feebly clinging to. This imperial presidency that they outline is not an imperial presidency. It's a means for accomplishing things when no one else will do anything. The president has the mandate of the people, and he is justified in taking such action because of it. But finally, let's look to our third question in today's round. Are these actions eventually effective? They say that no careful decision-making ever takes place if we were to employ executive action. But we've seen historically that this is simply untrue. We saw with President Lincoln the Emancipation Proclamation. It kickstarted an entire movement which eventually led to the greatest change our country has ever seen. We saw this with President Lyndon B. Johnson, we saw this with President Reagan, and we saw this with President Obama in the world today. These actions historically are effective, but even in circumstances where they're not perfect, no law is ever perfect. Executive actions may have certain flaws, but at least it's something. At least we're accomplishing some action and protecting the people who have no other voice for them. Only on side proposition do we fight for the people who are otherwise going to be cast out of our country. Only on side proposition do we save the hungry, and only on side proposition do we take means to protect anyone who is in this fantastic country. No, thank you. But next, we need to look to the fact that executive action is the only way to take hard stances on issues. Now, side opposition would like to have you believe that discourse and speeches is a great way to take a hard stance. But that's not a hard stance. Like Jasper outlined previously, the State of the Union address outlines a long laundry list of things, but rarely do they all get accomplished. Executive action is the only way to take a hard stance and then immediately go to it. The second speaker of the opposition clearly gets up here and tells us that they need controversy, and that controversy is bad because perception is what the president needs to care about. But perception isn't an issue here. If we care so much about perception and nothing ever gets done, what's the value of perception? There's nothing we can look to in that situation. But then they go on to say that these actions can be immediately repealed. But first, they have no guarantee that we're going to immediately repeal these actions. And second, even if they are repealed, at least something got done in that period of time. Nothing gets done inside opposition's world. But you disagree.
This is about not perception, but cooperation. Nothing can be passed through our Congress, and we can't have sustainable change in this country unless the president unifies us instead of polarizing us more.
It's ironic to say that because nothing's getting done in the world today. Where is Congress passing laws? Where is anything getting done? The only side in today's debate who takes an action, who makes a change, is side proposition. But finally, look to the fact that this isn't only in the short term. We're talking about kickstarting a long-term discussion on side proposition. And long-term discussions are spurred by controversy. Side opposition is so keen to cast controversy aside, but let's really analyze it. The only way we can make people look to discussions in the long term is to start a discussion, is to throw these issues of immigration, of reform, of slavery in the past even, into the limelight. And the only way we can do that is through executive action. Finally, when we look at today's debate, let's understand one thing. Side opposition does nothing. They advocate for a perfect world, a Congress that does everything. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where we have a president who has executive power, who has the mandate of the people, who's justified in taking action, and who must do so to save everyone who pledges to this flag up here. And for that reason, I'm so proud to propose today's motion.
Thank you, Millen, for that very convincing speech. And now we invite the third speaker of the opposition, Matthew Zhang. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I will bind this debate, like the books in this library, into one cohesive story to listen to. The first step is to look at the book that we return, namely The Tall Tale of Team Government. Then we'll look at the success story of Team Opposition. Lastly, we'll look at 3 lessons that you can put in your own book report that we take away from this exchange. So let's start off with The Tall Tales of Team Government, the book we return. First, we think that they bring up this argument about crisis, and that presidents derive a special authority during times of anxiety. First, what we would tell you is that emergency organizations like FEMA work without executive action, in fact, have moral and legal justification to do so. Not only, but when these organizations act, they unify our nation as a symbol of national cooperation, not a single dictator telling us what to do. What we'd also tell you is that presidential executive authority has no bright line. It's insanely easy to misconstrue presidential authority. Do not forget the example that Team Opposition brought you since our first speech of FDR's executive action that implemented Japanese internment camps, treating thousands of Japanese American citizens as nothing more than cattle to be corralled into these concentration camps. We think that Team Government hasn't appropriately dealt with the fact that executive action is surrounded by legal ambiguity, that it has no boundaries, and we're not sure where the power ends. What we'd lastly tell you about this crisis argument is that slow Congress, even if it is gridlocked, preserves the dignity of policy. We think that they have a far more, we think that they don't create myopic policy, and that they take into consideration the basic foundations of what comprises our democracy. But then they give us this argument about structural problems. First, what we tell you is that when we're talking about things like racism or segregation in the military, that, one second please, long-term laws are the true source of solutionisms. Even though President Truman implemented some kind of executive action to force integration in the military, it was long-term legislative action in the future that really did ensure racial equality in the United States and opportunities for racial minorities in the military. But I hear some tension coming to the right side.
You say Congress preserves dignity, but why should we ever care about dignity when it comes at the cost of millions of lives that are perishing because of a lack of action for refugees and immigrants?
That's an interesting point, Amelia, and I'm so glad you brought it up. While we admit that saving refugees is a good benefit, what we tell you is that the aftermath is far worse for 2 specific reasons. First, what we tell you is that when you implement this kind of refugee-saving executive action, it kills future reform. In fact, what we tell you is that when we implement action like Obama did, that it actually ends immigration reform. That's the analysis that Nikki and Jane gave you. But what we'd also tell you is that Team Government does nothing to resolve the actual crises at hand. The real questions we need to be asking are why are the refugees in danger in the first place? Why is the United States having to save them in a recurring process? And what can we do to save a real systemic problem? We see no solutions from Team Government. But then they continue with this argument about discourse. Firstly, what we tell you is a conversation is corrupted. Neutrality or ambivalence is inherently impossible in an environment where the president tells us what our opinion is. Nikki's introduction was pretty persuasive in instructing us exactly why the president has no authority in telling the nation what our action should be single-handedly. But secondly, what we tell you is that the characterization of Congress and Team Government's world is factually incorrect. The discourse and argumentation already exists in Congress, that we're already talking about critical issues. But the problem with executive action is that it seems to be the final stamp on these kinds of discussions. It seems to end any debate that we have. In fact, what we tell you is that when we pass executive actions, it tricks our national debating into thinking that things have been solved, and to thinking that a real action has been taken. That's the characterization of executive actions that Team Government gave us. Then they give us this thing about long-term change, and they give us a number of cool-sounding examples, like the Emancipation Proclamation and President Reagan's immigration reform. Let's challenge these two examples. First, we think that Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually garner the real change. We think that there's a whole movement of abolitionism before this executive action was passed, and that abolitionist movement was the real reason behind actual change in the United States. What we'd also tell you is that actions like the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually end slavery. In fact, they only allowed things like sharecropping and black codes to pop up after the Civil War. But it also didn't eliminate slavery in the South. And it even didn't eliminate slavery in the border states because President Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve his own political capital. In fact, what the Emancipation Proclamation reveals is that real political movements that garner real change are the reason why we have actual movements in the United States. But that executive actions are often used by presidents in order to cut through these discussions and gain political points. But then they give us this thing about President Reagan's immigration reform. We think that an unintended consequence of this reform was that it allowed undocumented immigrants into the United States, and that the nuclear family clause allowed thousands of undocumented immigrants into the United States. What we'd also tell you is that this executive action set up no humane route for deportation, and that after this executive action, deportation continued in the United States as one of the cruelest in the world. And while reforms have come, it's not because of executive action. Understanding that Team Government's story is one that we just don't want to hear, let's go to the nice one of the day, Team Opposition's success tale. We give you this idea of the growing arsenal of presidential power, that the tale of executive power's growth spiral is both real and disturbing. We give you this idea of the ambiguity of enforcement. Team Government gives us two separate ideas. First, they tell you that the public votes up the president, and that justifies his action. I'm going to set up the groundwork for Nick to explain to you how this is a classic debate logical fallacy. But what I'd also tell you is that the public doesn't even justify every one of the president's actions. The president is there to execute the actions that Congress undertakes, not make his own. But then they tell us that the public has influence over the president, and that checks the president's power. First, what we tell you is that the threshold for changing executive action is much higher than the threshold for changing congressional action. When it comes to the legislature, we can pass referendums. We can vote out our congressional leaders. But when it comes to the president, the best thing that we can do is impeach them. But that's only happened once in the United States history, proving that the psychological and sociological threshold for impeaching presidents is absurdly high, and that the actual check that the public has on the president just doesn't exist. But then they give us the idea that the Founding Fathers didn't predict political isolation. I have three answers to this argument. First, what we tell you is that this issue of gridlock and slow politics is inherent to an American system, and that we see it throughout our history. But what we also tell you is that every single harm that Team Government has brought to you in today's debate regarding gridlock is a product of their own proposition. We think that gridlock exists in the modern day Congress because Congress people are angry over presidents taking single-handed action. That immigration reform is dead in the ground because President Obama refused to listen and participate with the rest of Congress. What we lastly tell you about this is that immediate policy doesn't resolve systemic issues. Immigration reform and matters like it are wide, expansive issues, and one executive action is myopic and cannot resolve these systemic problems that we've been debating about in the status quo. Understanding that this book is one that you want to keep at home and avoid the librarian with, I'm going to give you three special lessons today that you take away from this debate. First, alternatives like speeches and presidential direction of the nation work. The status quo of executive action has proven itself to be malfunctional. Look no further than the fact that Obama is being sued by half of the country. President Reagan himself proved the power of persuasion. Maybe Team Government didn't, but we think that the president is more than just a speaker and more than just someone who signs executive actions. We think the president is powerful, but needs to exert his influence in a way better than just signing executive actions. But secondly, what we tell you is that executive actions clog policymaking. The discourse is masked by the perception that executive action solves problems, and that policies are undone or rejected by an angry Congress, an angry set of states, or an angry populace. But the last lesson we learned today is that a spoonful of prevention is worth more than a basketful of cures, that myopic policymaking self-destructs, that doing something just for the sake of doing something is logically and morally unreasonable, and that taking the time to make good legislation has long-term stability. At the end of the day, we reject their myopic vision, we reject their model, and we beg you to do the same. Please listen to Nick's speech as he seals the deal.
Thank you, Matthew, for turning the page in this debate. And now we welcome Nicholas Angelopoulos to close the side opposition. Hear, hear.
All right, before I begin my speech, I'd really like to thank everybody for being here, the audience, my opponents, our coaches, and thank the Reagan Library for having us. This is an incredible honor and a dream come true. Thank you. Why is President Ronald Reagan considered one of the most powerful presidents of all time? Because the presidents with the greatest capacity to change this country for the better are the ones that don't abuse their power. True change comes from cooperation, not coercion. The most powerful presidents are the great communicators, not the great legislators. And that's why we're so proud to oppose this motion that allows the president to step all over our legislative process. I'm going to show you why through three clashes. First of all, I'm going to ask the question, is executive action democratic? Second of all, is it necessary to have executive action to stop major crises? And third, does this make the political climate of America better? So first, is executive action democratic? The proposition side comes up and gives you two textbook debate fallacies on this issue. They say, first, we have a Supreme Court case that says this is true, and second, the people voted for the president and agree with this policy, therefore it must be correct. On the second one, we'd like to factually contest this. We don't think that's actually true, but regardless, their first argument is an appeal to authority, and their second is an ad populum fallacy. Neither of these things truly justify voting for the proposition, because is the Supreme Court always right? Of course not. They voted for separate but equal. And so instead of just appealing to people that we think are more powerful than us, we should have meaningful discourse. On the second issue, voting for the president doesn't make anything that the president does legal. The only person that would actually think that is President Nixon, who said, and I quote, "The president does something, it must be legal." You shouldn't vote on that. On the opposition, we have actual analysis on this. We say that the role of a president, especially in times where major debate and gridlock is happening in this country, is to engage in persuasion, to unify the country, to create discourse, not to shut it down. And by the way, yeah, that's a major contradiction on their side of the debate. They say the time to use executive action is during times of gridlock, and then they say also that it's going to start a conversation. Hello, the conversation is happening in Congress. You shouldn't just shut it down. Their only answer to this is people don't talk about things during gridlock. Have they proven to you that executive action on an issue is the only way to get the American public to start talking about a major policy? Of course not. The president has lips, not just a hand to sign off policy. They can talk. They can talk in places other than the State of the Union address. Speech is powerful. It can create change. Why are we here in this room today? Because words can actually influence people. President Ronald Reagan brought down the Berlin Wall with a series of speeches. Who says we can't do the same with legislation? Why should you vote against this just because it's undemocratic? There's lots of good things we can do, even regardless of practical benefits, that we don't do just because they're undemocratic. We shouldn't just sign away our rights to have meaningful legislation just because the president can pass diktats that we think are good for this country. We have to do things that are in line with our policies, that don't step all over our government, that are consistent with our democracy. On the second clash, is it necessary to have executive action to combat major crises? The only thing they really say on this is that major crises in this country are insular moments in time in which we have to implement an executive action immediately to solve. What we say is that that's a very not nuanced picture of what an actual major crisis is. For example, refugee crises take months and months to happen and to solve, but Congress can pass a law within a week. That's more than enough time to pass a policy. We also give you alternatives. They say we're not taking action. We give you alternatives to take action. We say FEMA courts can solve and things like FEMA courts can solve, and we say that sustainable policy with less backlash can happen, and you can avoid all of our harms about how if you repeal policies through executive action, you can leave millions of people stranded without the political capital to continue helping them them in the future. On our third clash, does this make the political climate of America better? We say no. This loses the president his or her most important power, the power to communicate with Congress, to unify people, and they're worried about gridlock. Talk about making gridlock worse. There's no way the president can come back to Congress on his or her knees after passing policies over their heads and then try to get sustainable policy passed. The only real answer that they have to this is that you shouldn't reject something just because it makes people angry. We say no. It's not the anger that causes the problem. It's the fact that ultimately important legislation won't be solved if there's political gridlock. That the president loses the power to unify this country and pass legislation in the future, and that the same people that they're trying to help years and years after this executive action happens, their reforms will be stifled because the political polarization of this nation needs to be stopped. We need to go forward together. This country is like a family, and families don't operate based on dictators passing policy. The power must be in the hands of the people. The power must be in the hands of the majority. Don't let this policy pass.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that extremely passionate speech. And now we welcome Amelia to close this debate. Here.
Though side opposition talks a lot about President Reagan's power of persuasion and communication, side proposition believes that actions speak louder than words, particularly executive actions. And President Reagan gave one each week. Because we agree with President Reagan's choice to harness the power of executive actions for good, we firmly propose the motion today. This debate comes down to three questions. The first is, are executive actions necessary? The second is, are they effective? And the third is, are they justified? So let's look at the first one now. Side opposition spends a lot of time talking about the merits of a slow, thoughtful Congress, yet they refuse to engage with the specific situations we bring up, where we do not have the luxury of time. Instead, they try to dismiss these as small downsides. But let me remind you how large these stakes are. The first case is in the case of humanitarian crisis, because when crisis is on the brink of erupting, we do not have time to sit around and wait. We give you the example of President Obama's recent action to help the processing and improve the speed of deportation of tens of thousands of children pouring in through the border. Without this action, these children might have been separated from their families or sent back into the dangerous communities they fled from in the first place. Side opposition tells you that this doesn't matter, but we tell you that these are millions of lives that clearly do. The second case that we bring up is the case of gridlock. Side opposition tells you that Congress is slow, thoughtful, and thorough. And while we do agree that they are slow, we are not so sure about the thoughtful and thorough. Because we believe that today, Congress is driven more by party politics than a true desire to make good policy. And we'd argue that recent efforts by the Republican Party to wage lawsuits against President Obama is proof that the dialogue in Congress is destructive and not constructive. Side opposition claims that gridlock is going to get worse because of executive action. But we say, how much worse can it get? We've been trying for 20 years, over 10 times, to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and we have failed. Gridlock is not new, and it is not caused by executive action. It is inherent to our political system that is driven by party politics, and we believe it is unacceptable. So let's look at the second question now, which is, are executive actions effective? We say yes, both on the short term and the long term. Let's examine the short term first. We give you a lot of empirical analysis that shows the success of many executive actions across a wide array of issues, such as the integration of the military by President Truman and the Immigration Family Act by President Reagan. These were directed initiatives that solved pressing issues and made a difference in real people's lives. But side opposition has a couple trivial problems with this. Their first is loopholes and bad policy. But first, we'd say that this is quite insignificant when weighed against the lives improved by these sweeping reforms. But furthermore, we think they're naive to think that loopholes don't exist in legislation passed by Congress itself. In fact, they're rampant. This is a problem with legislation, not executive action.
Their next objection is the possibility of harmful actions and overreach, like the internment example that they give. But we tell you that there are checks. The president is scrutinized by the media and public alike, and side opposition affirms this when they talk about a backlash that is provoked when a president overreaches. We believe that this is true, exactly, so it's in the president's own interest not to overreach. We believe that these checks are the reason that side opposition has one example of a bad executive action, not 10. But let's look at the long term now. We tell you that executive action and executive order is key to sparking a conversation and long-term change. There's a reason that presidents never accomplish the agenda they set in their State of the Union. It's because speeches don't have the same power as action. With the action, we have the controversy and the national attention to marshal change in the future, and we believe that it's important. But finally, let's look at the last question, which is it justified? We say that the president is the only official elected by the entire country, and when no one in the government can act to make change, he must fulfill his duty to protect the people. But moreover, we say that their constitutionality arguments are irrelevant. That's because the Founding Fathers never envisioned a situation where Congress would be paralyzed with inaction in a time of crisis. They say the Supreme Court's not always right. We say that the Constitution's not always right, which is why we should look to the Supreme Court, our authority on interpreting the Constitution in modern cases, and we should listen to it and that it has approved the legitimacy of executive action. So when it comes down to it, this debate is quite clear. Side opposition relies on a Congress that sits in their chambers waging lawsuits, while refugees are sent back to their dangerous homelands, slaves are kept in their shackles, and everyone who is not a straight white male faces employment discrimination. Side proposition refuses to be a bystander as these atrocities continue, and we hope that you all will refuse to as well. And then just one final thank you from all the team. This was a really amazing opportunity for us, and we're really thankful for our coaches and everyone in the audience in the Reagan Library for letting us give you a sense of what we do and having us here. So thank you from us all.
Thank you, Amelia, for those remarkable remarks. And I'd like to close this debate and invite both teams to shake hands as the audience and the judges reflect on the debate. We thank you all for listening so intently, and we hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
What shall